My name's Brian Concannon. I'd just like to say I think the US is a rogue superpower. It's a shame. I haven't come prepared tonight, so I'm not a good talker, so I'm reading it. Not like you fellas, you're sensational, didn't miss a beat. Great presenters, I hand to you. My question is about US involvement in the downfall of the countries mentioned tonight and America's quest for world hegemony, especially countries in the BRICS alliance. I read somewhere, I think a Brandon Tourville article, that the Brazilian US puppet elites started their campaign a year ago to destabilise and impeach Rousseff, to break apart BRICS and make Brazil just another US vassal state. Anything you can tell me about that would be greatly appreciated, fellas.
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is to do a little bit of history. Go back to the 70s and you see the intervention in the overt intervention by the United States over there, right, during that time. Today is different. They learned the lesson. They are not as overt. All right? They already have the local elites doing the dirty job for them. The only thing the United States is doing is just funding them, all right? And you can check the US budget for financial aid to Latin America, and they overtly say we are giving the money to these democratic movements, all right? But they are not as overt as in the 1970s. They're just letting them follow the natural course, okay? There is no doubt that the United States is benefiting from the coming of Mauricio Macri to government, the emergence of Brazil. They are the two big powerhouses in terms of geopolitics in South America, Argentina and Brazil, right? This morning, I think the best person who described the whole situation between Argentina and Brazil and how they are sabotaging the integration, Latin American integration, was Pepe Mujica. Pepe Mujica said this morning that Brazil and Argentina are pretty much shitting on the table, right? That was pretty much what they're doing in terms of sabotaging. They are undermining Mercosur, the campaign to get rid of Maduro taking over the pro tempore presidency of Mercosur. That's a clear example, right? And there is no doubt that both Macri and Brazil especially are going to lean towards the Alliance of the Pacific, which is the new free trade agreement that is going to develop, which Australia is part of, right? So it's not as over, but definitely they are benefiting from it. Right? Does it make sense?
That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure that I would describe the BRICS as an alliance, but I'm not really up on those sorts of things. But what I do know is that there has been a considerable amount of Chinese investment in Latin America, and this includes Venezuela. So Venezuela actually has quite a large debt to China. And it's in China's interest, therefore, for the Venezuelan economy to stay alive and for the Venezuelans to be able to repay that debt. And I would think that, given that the Chinese government would like to see the continuation of the Maduro government, and similarly for Russia, and look, I can't get into these international politics. I don't know enough about it, but I could envisage. I mean, one of my fears is that given that global capitalism is in such dire straits at the present time, after the crash in 2008, and the fact that they can't get production again, my fear is that we are going to have a third world war, and if that were to occur, and you're looking at who's going to be fighting whom in that, I guess we've just had those recent military recent military joint action of the Chinese and the Russians. So conceivably, it could be the United States and its allies against an alliance of China and Russia, but this is getting into the realms of utter speculation. And which way Latin American countries would go in that case, obviously what would benefit them most probably would be neutrality. But if the US has got close relationships with right-wing governments that's helped to install in Latin America, then we might see Latin American countries decide with the United States in a new global conflict. But as I said, this is complete speculation, and we're all free to speculate, I guess.
My name's Jim. I've had a long-standing involvement in Latin American solidarity, and I've also lived in Venezuela and travelled in Latin America. And I think the idea of fundamental optimism is correct, because what I feel is happening, it's like some kind of scientific principle of swings and roundabouts in politics. I know that in Venezuela, having visited Venezuela a number of times, what you've had in Venezuela is an incredible situation which Peter referred to as the most radical experiment in the 21st century. And they've had a mass mobilisation of the people for something like 15 years. And in politics, it's very, very hard to maintain a mass mobilisation for 15 years. And I think that the swing back to the right is sort of like an opportunist and something that's been planned from the United States and organised. But I have a feeling like the people have not really spoken again. That we're going to see a new rise of the popular movement in Latin America when people realise what the stakes are really at. And the economic crisis, the world economic crisis, has hit Latin America. It's hit the prices of commodities, and that's the most fundamental thing that has affected the governments there. So I wonder if you could comment. I mean, I have seen the operation of the communes and the communal councils in Latin America, and I find it hard to believe that those mass organisations are not going to rise up again in Venezuela and allow the whole thing. They're not going to allow the whole thing to fall down. So I just wonder what your feeling is about what's going to happen in Brazil, what's going to happen in Argentina, and what's going to happen in Venezuela. Also, I should add that we haven't included in our palette Bolivia and Ecuador, which are the radical wingers up the top of South America. It's Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. I have a feeling we're going to see a new rise of the popular movements in those countries, which will, be a counter-reaction to the right-wing offensive that's happened at the moment. If you could comment on that, thank you.
I think one of the main criticisms that have been going around towards this progressive government is the high reliance on one person, a leader. All right. If Chavez was not there, the Bolivarian revolution was going to collapse. If Evo Morales is not there, Bolivia is going to go right. If Cristina Fernandez is not there, all right, the right was going to come back. I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses that all these projects have, and I believe that Argentina is the one that's working hardest in coming with a new generations of leaders, especially with the youth. Shortly after the election in Argentina, Cristina Fernandez and the FPV created like a think tank to form the new generation of leaders. All right, not depend only in just one person running the party. All right, bring like the Minister for Economics, for example, Axel Kicillof. Right? There's a new generation of leaders that can replace and take the project without depending on just one person. The person is important to begin the project, but once the project is running, new people should come in, and that's what's I think is going to happen. Right? There is an impasse now. There's uncertainty, but people eventually is going to take, as you said, people is going to, when the situation starts hitting the pockets of the people, right, they're going to move on. You know, when there was the coup in 2002 against Chavez, it was the people, the one who came out to the streets and defended the Bolivarian revolution. Right? That's my
First of all, with regard to swings and roundabouts, we can go to the pink tide here, and we look at a tide and it goes in and out. So, you know, that is simply a metaphor, of course, for what's going on, but we could draw from that. And Jim Levy over there was saying to me a couple of weeks ago about the fact that, you know, when you've got representative democracies and liberal democracies, and what happens is that after a time, then people do vote for the other side. You know, the governments get tired, and for whatever reason, there's a change that takes place. As usual, when Jim says something, I immediately reject it, but thinking about it, I suspect there's a certain amount of truth in that. Now, the other thing I would say, you know, the mass organisations themselves, you know, they have built up a history now. A lot of people have got experience in those sorts of struggles, and I'm sure if we go look amongst ourselves, then most of us have got a history of struggle. And, you know, there's a lot that we draw on, and we look back to the past. Now, the Latin Americans probably do this a lot more than we do. And you just have to look at the fact that Chavez starts a Bolivarian movement. He's referring back to the liberator Simón Bolívar, who in many ways was not the sort of figure, a revolutionary figure. In fact, he was an elite bastard, really, in lots of ways. And he, you know, it was history that led him to actually finally decide that he wouldn't support slavery. You know, it was necessary for him to bring. It was necessary for him, you know, to say he would free the slaves, all right, because he wouldn't win the struggle without doing that. So it's you know, he's not a great revolutionary figure, but the point I'm making is that it's looking back. And so similarly in Chiapas in Mexico, you have the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. They're looking back to Zapata. In Nicaragua, it's the Sandinistas. They're looking back to Sandino. And what we have here now is a new historical struggle with figures like Hugo Chavez, Nestor Kirchner in Argentina, Lula in Brazil, who's still around, of course. But, you know, you've got a new history and something that the Latin American left can look back to and draw upon. And they do this much more. It's a cultural difference with Australia. We tend not to do this, but they do it a lot. And so, you know, as far as the mass movements go, then yes, the memory will live on and people will draw on that, and we shall see new movements develop. But, you know, whether we're going to have to wait a bit for this to occur or not we just have to wait and see.
My question's on the other end of the wonderful continent of South Latin America, and that's Chile. I saw in the press recently two things. One was that they have finally arrested, and I don't know if they've charged, the police officers who tortured Victor Jara to death. And I'd be interested if either of your speakers know the outcome of that, and if it's become a focal point for challenging neoliberalism post-Pinochet, with all the students rioting in the streets in Chile over the last couple of months. And I assume it's from cutbacks, but what's the future of Chile? Will it be a neoliberalist agenda, or will there be a resurgence, a Bolivian, a Bolivarian, or some other sort of resurgence based around the New Song movement of the 70s revolution of Salvador Allende, or where's that going? Thank you.
I don't know. To begin with, is Chile really progressive?
No, well, it's got a neoliberalist agenda.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Much better than Pinochet.
Mm-hmm.
Better than Pinochet.
For sure, but there's still Pinochet ministers still in parliament. Just recently, yesterday, I was reading that one of the ministers of Pinochet, during the era of Pinochet, is arguing to move the retirement age until 80. Seriously.
Yeah, well, Pinochet's
Hang on.
finance minister was Opus Dei, and the finance minister of New South Wales, Dominic Perrignon or whatever, he is Opus Dei as well. So there is a connection.
They're in the same family. I mean, the case of Chile is, I think, is the most moderate or leaning towards the center right out of all the progressive governments that came out, of those post-neoliberal governments. They have been really active in supporting the Pacific Alliance, all right? And they're still debating what they're going to do with the issue of the education. I mean, on the one hand, you got Bachelet arguing and trying to defend the project of making education public, but the reality is that the conservative forces in Chile are really, really strong. And there is a white elephant in the room that we haven't addressed. Peter just mentioned it briefly today, early today, and is the issue of the media. Right? In Chile, I was reading this morning actually a report that said that it's the country with the highest concentration of media networks in the entire continent, right? And the media in Chile have played, from the time of Allende until today, they have played a really strong role in supporting the dictatorship, in sabotaging the court cases for the investigations on human rights, and trying to keep the neoliberal agenda in stage.
Just briefly, earlier Jim was telling me that the Obama administration has released the documents with regard to the Letelier assassination, which Jim says clearly implicate Pinochet in ordering that execution. So that's a bit of positive news, I guess. When we look at the policies in Chile, Chile is the first country to go neoliberal in the world in 1975, and it's got deep roots in Chile. We do see revolts against that, such as the students a few years back, and that struggle continues. And of course, they've got to fight against that Pinochet constitution, which is geared towards the elites and keeping the left at bay. So that's a long struggle, and somebody like Bachelet, I think, is pulled in a couple of directions, and it's interesting with regard to Chile's support for the Pacific Alliance, which in some ways rips Latin America apart, Latin American unity apart again. But she's also expressed a desire to forge closer links with Mercosur. Mind you, as a country, they've signed free trade agreements with almost everybody. So they attempt that sort of dance, but I don't have much hopes at the present time. There are, of course, struggles around the Mapuche, which continue. But principally, it seems to me it's about the Mapuche, it's about the students, it's about education. But there's also, the memory and the victories that are made in that area. I'm not giving up on Chile.
Recently, Venezuelan journalist Jose Chente Rangel alleges that US intelligence agencies have sent about 500 agents, to Venezuela, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador and Cuba with the sole purpose of destabilising the government. In addition, the US State Department is attempting to reverse the pink tide, which it regards as a threat to its neoliberal agenda, through its various funding agencies, its democracy assistance and civil society programs that currently operate under the banner of USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Office of Transition Initiatives and the Economic Support Fund, all designed to destabilise those regimes and to reverse the pink tide, to undermine the Bolivarian revolution and to re-establish the neoliberalist model. And it reminds me of 1973, with the overthrow of Salvador Allende. One of the first things that happened was that the Chicago school, the Chicago boys, went down there and trialled their new neoliberalist ideas in Chile. And we all saw the defeat of the labour movement in Chile was everyone's defeat. So bearing that in mind, what can we do to protect the anti-neoliberalist movements, the progressive, popular people's movements in those countries? What can we do to defend them? How important is it?
I think, obviously, information is the key. Make people aware of what's happening. That's the key. But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the people back in Latin America to defend the gains that they have. Okay. There are theories of social science and sociology that said that humans have a different rank of needs. Okay. The most basic needs are shelter and food. Okay. Once you achieve and secure those needs, you start looking at different things, comfort, better clothes, all right? And just recently, Rafael Correa was explaining this on the shortfalls of this pink tide, okay? They were really good at securing the basic needs of the people, right? But a lot of people change the interest, all right? They say, okay, now we got the house, we got the food, we got job, okay? We want something else. They start looking at different things. And perhaps that's one of the criticisms that have been made to this government, that they overlook the new needs of the people. That's something that actually they are discussing in these forums that they're making, right? Okay, how can we look, or how can we begin to address all those needs without forgetting the people who are still in the below poverty line, all right? But at the end of the day, as I say, it's up to the people. People start rising, moving. When they see that they start losing their jobs and everything, they're going to complain and they're going to come out. Okay, there's going to be repression for sure. Neoliberals are really good at repressing people, but you can push it so far. Unfortunately, it's the way things are.
Yes, obviously the United States traditionally has, regards Latin America's backyard, and it does what it wants to in Latin America. That's what it's always done. And there does seem to be a bit of a fresh push at the moment. But, I go back to the mention I made about Trump. We could also look at Sanders, and what we do see in the United States, it's not a new thing, but it seems to be more important at the present time, is that there's an increasing number of people who are opposed to neoliberalism in the United States itself. So, that may be a positive. I say maybe because, as I was saying before, we could also speculate that what will happen is it'll develop into a fascist state itself, and, like other fascist states will then set out on imperial adventures because it can't be completely autarkic and needs an empire to support that. But we'll just have to wait and see on that. With regard with solidarity in Latin America, what Fernando said, we can debate about this, keep ourselves informed. I don't think that Australians as such can be very important. It does come to the Latin American people, and as people who live in this nation state, our struggle primarily is going to be with our own right wing here. So I should imagine that's probably going to take up the energies of most people on the left in Australia. But, Australians have always been, the Australian left has always been very strong with regard to solidarity with other parts of the world, including with Latin America. And who was it mentioned before about the New Song movement? And if we go back to the 70s, that the support that the left gave to the Chileans and to others, but principally to the Chileans at that time, and those thousands of people who attended those concerts, for example, of Quilapayún and Inti Illimani and Los Para, and I'm sure many of you are in that audience. We do what we can, I guess.
So far, really interesting. Thank you. The one element we haven't talked about in terms of politics is in the pink tide, the withdrawal of the military in Latin America. And I'm wondering what your analysis of the current situation of the militaries, I know you can't go through them all, is at the moment, because they certainly have a veto.
the most obvious cases are, or the most interesting cases have been Venezuela, Bolivia, and Argentina. Right? The one I have been following the closest has been Argentina. They changed completely their military doctrine. They introduced the studies on human rights in the at the hardcore of the military academy. Okay, and so far they have retreated. They, I think they learned from their mistakes. Their reputation has been severely damaged during the 70s, and they don't want to get involved. If they, as much as they can avoid it, they don't want to get involved with some There are some real exceptions, like in Honduras, for example, with the military coup in Honduras.
Yeah.
But in general, they have tried to remain away. Okay?
Change the electronics. It's in the speaker.
But it depends. Now with Macri coming back in power, it's like we were saying earlier.
Just
It's like we were saying earlier. The new right, didn't disappear. They just went back to fight another day. They went to recuperate their energies, their forces. They develop new strategies and come back again. The military, one can argue that can do exactly the same. They just stay back, and they are quite happy. They hate politicians to begin with. Okay, one of the first things that they learn at the military academy is that politics sucks. Okay, and they don't want to know anything about politics. I had some insight on that, but they're quite happy just to sit back and let them do their job if they're needed. They're just hoping. There is a strong fascination among Latin American militaries with the U.S. doctrine, okay, and the level of respect that people in the United States have to their own military forces. All right, they really envy the United States because in Latin America people hate the military. Okay, we have no respect for them. As much as they try, and in Argentina they really tried in the last decade to change the image. All right, to do some more community work, and in that sense it helped a little bit. But Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, for us is just useless.
The military is complex. It's not a simple thing to analyse. And what took place in Argentina with the Kirchner governments is that they really were brought to heel. But of course, and so a lot of those former dictators and military leaders and police were brought to trial for what they did during the Dirty War. So that was a real plus. But when you're looking at other countries, if you're looking at Chile or Brazil, then the militaries in those countries oversaw the turn to democracy. So they were not defeated. The Argentine military, of course, were defeated by the British in the Malvinas. So you've got to look at each one. But another thing about the militaries in Latin America is that many of them can see the benefits of having developed countries, including a manufacturing sector, because the last thing that a military wants to be is dependent upon other parts of the world for its weaponry. And so it's necessary to have a heavy industry, it's necessary to have the production of military hardware. The Brazilian military is certainly very much aware of this. And so they've always, even while they were running the country with military dictators, then, they were pushing for economic development in that sense. And heading towards something that's a more independent position, so they're not reliant, as the Argentine military were, on the French for their Exocet missiles in the Malvinas conflict, and of course the French decided not to give them, not to sell them to the Argentine military. So the military does play a role in development in many of these countries, and certainly during the dictatorships, and possibly still today, some of those militaries some of them still have a foot in industry. Some of them still have their own companies, their own industrial plants. So the military can go in different ways, and Venezuela is a good example of this, where it ends up being it produces the revolutionary leader in Hugo Chavez, and for all the splits in militaries, including the Venezuelan military, because they're not homogeneous, then they've continued to support the revolutionary governments in Venezuela.
If I just can add one thing. With Argentina, Peter mentioned the industrial complex in the military, and that's true. And they built planes they developed the whole new plane industry in Argentina, and they said
And Brazil.
A couple of new planes, a joint effort. And now with Macri, when Macri came into power, the first thing he did was to scrap that project and buy planes from the United States, like 20 years older and with obsolete.
Yeah.
And Fernando knows a lot more about this. You have to read his book about Operation Condor. But one of the aspects of Condor was that it was Latin American militaries getting together in order to destroy the left, and in order to push through their agendas at that time. But it did mean, this is one of the first times that we see close cooperation between Latin American institutions in different countries. And one of the results of this, I would argue, in part anyway, is the formation of organisations like Mercosur.
What are your thoughts about what are going to be the effects of the normalisation of the states with Cuba? I can see two possibilities: that the Americans will have soft power, try and have an influence there. Is that possible? Or is Cuba going to be not only, develop even further itself along social lines, and will it be of assistance? Will it be relevant to the struggles in Latin America? So which way will Cuba go, and how significant will it be? How significant will it be for the left struggles in Latin America?
Cuba is Cuba. Yes. Okay, and it's going to always, no matter what happens in the future, it's always going to be a strong influence for the leftist movement in Latin America. I think there is no question about that. In terms of normalization of relations, the blockade is still there, and the blockade against Cuba is still there. And
it's still there.
Yeah. And they open embassies. People are traveling. They are allowed to send some certain amount of money. Okay, but at the end of the day, the blockade and Guantanamo are still on the hands of the United States. So I don't think it's going to make much difference.
Okay, so can I ask you please to thank our two speakers, Dr. Peter Ross and Dr. Fernando Rodriguez.